Hey, you know that friend that stares deep into your soul and asks, are you happy? What's the decision-making process that happens really quickly in your brain when someone asks you that question? Is it something I'm feeling? Is it something I'm living? Is it some combination of the two? Am I supposed to say the right answer? What if I say no? Does that even mean that something's wrong with me? Let's unpack happiness. I want to dig a little bit more into what I think is probably the most common definition of happiness that we routinely throw around, and that is happiness equals pleasurable feelings. And I want to show how this really can't be all there is to happiness. A really good example of this from some research is a famous study that Cornell did years ago. They looked at parents of small children and they gave them an app that would randomly check in with them during the day as they were doing their parenty things. And they asked them when the app would check in with them to rate what they were doing and how happy they were, what their subjective mood was in that moment. So again, think of parents of young children and ask yourself how their subjective ratings of pleasure or happiness looked from moment to moment. It doesn't take a genius to realize that, of course, it was going to be highly varied and maybe make them not look very happy at all. And that's exactly what happened. Researchers found that by and large, parents were way happier doing things like exercising or doing the laundry than they were as they were doing parenting. The problem is this is just one definition of happiness. And again, a pretty limited one, I think, right? Just the moment-to-moment subjective feelings of pleasure. That can't be all there is to happiness. So an interesting follow-up question happened. The researchers then asked the participants in the study, what was the most meaningful and enjoyable thing in their lives? And guess what their number one answer was? It was raising their kids. So either they're lying about being happy from the first set of data, or from the second set of data, we're compelled to understand happiness as far more complex than just moment-to-moment subjective feelings. If happiness were just pleasurable feelings, that would come with a lot of pressure to have those all the time. And maybe some of you have even been caught up in feeling that way. In modern Western societies, happiness is often equated with the maximization of pleasure. And some imagine that true happiness would consist of an uninterrupted succession of pleasurable experiences. This sounds more like a recipe for exhaustion than for genuine happiness. Oh, okay, so maybe happiness isn't feeling pleasurable feelings all the time. Maybe it's just not having bad feelings, right? Not really. Happiness and sadness, as it turns out, are related, of course, but they're not opposites. We think of them sometimes as opposite sides of the coin, but they're almost two different coins entirely. Neurological research shows us that the left cerebral cortex is more active with happiness, whereas the right cerebral cortex is more active with unhappiness, meaning they happen predominantly in different parts of your brain. And of course, we have to be careful with brain research and pinpointing where anything happens in a very complex system. But this just serves to illustrate that happiness is not just unsadness. In fact, you probably know this from experience or the people around you that you've observed. Some people can be both happier and unhappier than average. Let's continue unpacking happiness by comparing a couple prominent philosophical perspectives. The first is called hedonism. This is a word many of us have heard before. There are two simple rules to hedonism. 1, seek pleasure. 2, avoid pain. That's pretty much it. Sounds pretty simplistic, right? But I want to be careful. I don't want to knock hedonism too much. If you're honest with yourself and you consider how you live each day of your life and how you make decisions about what you're going to do or not do or put off for later, it has a lot to do with what's going to make me feel good versus what's going to make me feel bad. We're all a bit hedonistic. There is some value in that perspective, but I think it's limited. So did Aristotle. Aristotle came along and said, hold up. There has to be more to happiness than just seek pleasure and avoid pain. So Aristotle came up with a very different definition of happiness that I want to share with you. He called it eudaimonia, and his definition of happiness included these components. Identify your virtues, know the good stuff about you, cultivate it, develop it, and then put it out in the world, live by it, live in accordance with those things. And that, to Aristotle, equals happy. What I want you to notice about that definition of happiness is the complete lack of feeling words. There is nothing in there about pleasure or pain. Aristotle's definition of happiness is all about a way of living. So current research backs up both hedonism and eudaimonia, really, in some ways. Research has found that the pursuit of meaning and engagement are more predictive of life satisfaction and happiness than the pursuit of pleasure. But that same research also suggests that the pursuit of pleasure is still an important piece of that puzzle. It's not the most important piece. It's not the most substantive contribution. Happiness is much more than just a feeling.